Screaming from the Woods by Katie. This is an ongoing story as my creepy and paranormal experiences continue. I recently moved in with my boyfriend, and our house is deep in the Appalachian Mountains. This house has such a unique history. It was initially built as a log cabin in 1880. As the decades went on, each owner added a new addition to the house, expanding it to make it look more modern. But the original wood from the cabin and the cabin itself is still a foundation in the place, giving it a unique look. This home also has a darker side, which I believe causes my current experiences. Our neighbor told us the disturbing history of our home. Back in the 1880s, the original owner of this home owned some slaves. He kept them chained up in the basement, which also has its original foundation. He also told us how much of the surrounding area was part of the Civil War and how many regions were hollowed. The basement is intriguing but terrifying, knowing what happened down below. The basement is made of old stone, dirt, and pebbles. My boyfriend explored the cellar when he first bought the house. The neighbor's story of the enslaved people adds up to be accurate as my boyfriend found rusty hooks in the stone, showing someone could have been chained up there. And on top of that, he even found a femur bone, which I believe did turn out to be human. Since I moved in though, I've been experiencing weird phenomena. It all started a couple of months ago, late at night, sometime around 2:30 in the morning. I was in a deep sleep when I suddenly felt someone sitting on the edge of the bed, right on my side. At first I thought it was my boyfriend sitting there after using the bathroom or something, but I looked down and saw no one there. I saw my boyfriend fast asleep next to me, and my heart started pumping as I couldn't explain the feeling of someone sitting there. I could feel the pressure of it, and I could estimate the person's size just by the weight on the bed. But this could have been a one-time experience. But I was wrong. One night we were sitting on our deck enjoying the scenery of the mountains surrounding us. I looked at my boyfriend and asked, "Have you ever heard of the folklore about the Appalachian Mountains?" He said no, and I laughed saying, "So you've never heard of like skinwalkers or anything like that?" I was a fan of urban folklore like this at the time. I started acting out the story of skinwalkers like I was telling a report by a campfire or something. And they lure you in by mimicking your voice, you know? You can imitate anyone you know. Just as I said this, our heads darted to the darkness of the woods as we heard what sounded like a girl screaming with a slight guttural sound. I was baffled by how ironic the situation was. I pleaded that we go inside, but he denied me. He was enticed by it. "Let's wait and see if it comes out of the woods. Turn on the spotlight, babe." I did so, and we heard the scream again, but this time it was much closer at the border of the darkness outlining the woods. My boyfriend got spooked this time and we headed inside, locking the doors behind us. I always felt uneasy outside, as if someone had their eyes on me. My suspicions of this were confirmed when one night I was alone cooking dinner for us. That night I was just waiting for my boyfriend to come home. I saw two bright golden spheres from the corner of my eye. I turned, thinking it was his headlights, but my heart skipped when I saw that it was in fact at my window. It was low to the ground. It looked like eyes glowing and showing above the window ledge. It blinked at me as I stared at it. I turned for a second to grab my phone to record it, but when I turned back, it was suddenly gone. My latest experience was the most intrusive one yet. A few nights ago, I was waking up alongside my boyfriend who was getting ready for work. I was resting on my stomach with one leg bent up and the other straightened out. I was starting to doze off when I suddenly felt a hand swipe my leg over my privates and toward my lower back. I immediately woke up, looked over, expecting my boyfriend as the culprit. In confusion, I asked, "Was that you?" My boyfriend emerged from the hallway outside the room. "Was what me?" he said. "I just felt something touch me, like a hand. Was it you?" He looked at me confused. "I wasn't even in the room, babe." We both looked at each other, perplexed in silence. We both dismissed it, but since that morning, I haven't felt safe. I haven't felt like we're alone in this house. During the day, it's just me until 8 p.m. During the day, I hear noises, like if someone's going up the stairs and rattling things in the kitchen. I don't really know how to explain it. I still live in that house in the woods, and I don't really know what to do to escape these things. I've thought about maybe getting the house blessed, but I wanted to see what the swamp folk thought. Why You Shouldn't Hitchhike by Hawthorne R.P. So before I begin my story, I should mention that I had an unorthodox childhood with my mother. My mother had a crippling drug addiction, and I struggled with homelessness most of my life. She often blamed her shortcomings on me because I was diagnosed with cancer very young. Luckily, I've been in remission long enough and technically considered cured. I have been cancer-free most of my life at this point. It took until my teenage years for me to get tracked down and taken out of her custody. I met my biological father briefly for 3 years, but he shortly died of a terminal illness I knew about when he adopted me. So, traveling and hitchhiking have always been prevalent in my life. So with my father recently deceased after my 18th birthday and the lack of education in my childhood, I found myself back on the road, hitchhiking once again. It was very tough, and I do not recommend it to anybody. My knowledge of hitchhiking comes out of necessity, and there is more danger than romance. I ended up making some friends with some Native American teenagers that were around my age at the time. After hanging out with them and their folks, they allowed me to stay in his bedroom in this abandoned house on the edge of their property. Even though it was very worn down, and you could tell the property was not very much lived in, I wish I could remember exactly where it was, but it was somewhere between Arizona and Nevada. It was enough for me. You walk into this rundown small house with a dirt floor and immediately get this overwhelming feeling of love and happiness. The room was full of beer cans, graphic novels, battery-powered radio and CD players, chairs, and remnants of past good times. I remember one of the other native people I was friends with had a chihuahua that was yippy and immediately calmed down as soon as it entered the house. I mean, the moment it walked in, it would stop. It was kind of creepy. We would get stoned, talk, and have a great time. I remember having a strange dream that first night, though. I cannot tell you what it was, besides that it was somewhat pleasant, but it almost felt like I was looking into the future for a moment. When I woke up, these elongated dog tracks pressed deeply into the floor like paws were noticeable, and they were an impossibly big size. They made a complete circle around my sleeping bag. Whatever it was, left a ring with a deer carved into the metal that wasn't there before. There is nothing impressive about the ring besides that it looks incredibly old. The handmade metal that it was made of was quite heavy, and was definitely for a male hand. My friend insisted it was a gift from the house, and I kept it for many, many years. Still, after I received my gift, I had this intense urge to go back home to Portland, where I was born, so that's what I did. I hitchhiked all the way up there. There were many ups and downs, but it seemed like this oversized ring that I kept on a chain around my neck seemingly protected me from most of the bad things that went down. Eventually, though, I unfortunately did lose the ring at a hospital. I had some mild injuries after I got into a slight wreck after getting out of a car hitchhiking, and I can't remember what happened to it from there. But I know the story might seem anticlimactic, and maybe it's a little more wholesome than scary, but I hope you share this one with everyone. The Worst Night of My Life by Anonymous. One of the worst nights of my life was in December 2013. And to put it bluntly, and in as few words as possible, a tough Christmas had been rough on my mental health. And it went straight up from a shouting match to me just dipping out. I stormed out of our family home, screaming profanities and swearing they'd never see me again. Yeah, I was definitely that pleasant teenager. Sure, I'd forgotten my phone and wallet, but I was too proud to return to get them. So, in my fit of only partially warranted rage, I somehow decided it would be a good idea to try to hitchhike to my friend's house so that I could stay the night there. I'd never actually hitchhiked before. I don't think I'd even held my thumb out for a cab at this point. But I stood on a stretch of Florida highway trying to catch a passing driver's attention. To my surprise, someone pulled over rather quickly, and not the hippie bust rust bucket I had been visualizing either. It was one of those high-end Chevys, and I'm not sure what model it was, but the guy behind the wheel looked like he had quite a few dollars. He was the archetypal rich dad type, with nothing to indicate that he was anything but friendly and well-meaning.
Hop in,
he calls out from the passenger window. I couldn't believe my luck. Not only was I about to hitchhike for the first time, which felt pretty cool, I'm not going to lie, but I was about to do it in style. So, I couldn't really tell the difference between a faux leather and the real deal, but when you're in an air-conditioned sedan with a new car smell at 17, who cares? I felt grown up as hell. So the guy asked me why I'm hitchhiking, and honestly, I may have given him a hopped-up version of events, which made me out to be quite the victim. Abusive parents, poor me, blah blah blah. Naturally, he took this as gospel and started telling me how his father was an alcoholic and how he sympathized with my situation. I asked him to take me as far down the road as he was possibly willing to do, because I had a friend about 30 minutes away. He says cool, and down the highway we go. As he's driving, we talk a lot more about family. He pops the glove box and boom, there's a picture of his kids. As I look at his little girls, he starts telling me how important he thinks family is, especially to those from the less than stable backgrounds. Then he said something that seemed entirely out of character. We're pulling into a gas station after he mentions needing to fill up, continuing to the family convo and segments if that makes any sense. He'll stop talking 1 minute because he needs to focus on a turn or a lane switch, and then he carries on. So it was almost out of nowhere when he said something like,
"We have to protect our families from our own true nature."
I didn't know what to say at that moment, so I kind of just stayed quiet as he got out of the car and started filling up his tank. I had a few minutes to process those words, and the more I thought about them, the more I realized that hitchhiking might not have been such a good idea. When he returns after paying for the gas, there are quite a few moments as I'm still trying to figure out what he meant by his last little statement. So I just asked. I straight up asked him what he meant by it.
"It'll be easier if I show you."
You ever wondered what it would feel like to tuck and roll out of a moving vehicle? Have you ever tried to imagine it because you're about to do it, and you're pretty sure it'd kill you at the speed you're traveling? Probably not. I hadn't until that moment right then and there, but somehow I convinced myself I was just being overly dramatic. So I stayed in the car. I didn't even ask for him to pull over or anything. Jesus, looking back at it, I wasn't sure what was going through my head at all. Just that I didn't want to be around this guy anymore. He had gone from friendly and average to moody and creepy at light speed. "You know, everyone has secrets," he said after pulling into a dark commercial lot, shutting the engine off. So I imagine that line, spoken as creepily as you can imagine, meant that I was probably in big freaking trouble. I tried to keep my tone polite so I wouldn't freak this guy out or make him mad, but then he started freaking out. He showed me pictures of his kids, mentioned his wife, and even complained about how his in-laws were not nice to him. I knew this guy was a predator at this point. He saw someone vulnerable, who had a rough childhood or family background, and saw someone he could manipulate. It was the look in his eyes, not this weak, I like you look, but it was like hunger. The way he wanted, I could only describe it, was like excitement for a feast. That's when he said something weird, because he put his hand on me. I can't remember exactly what he was saying, because at that moment I tuned everything out and absolutely went numb. The moment he put his hand on my thigh, I froze up like a deer in the headlights. I knew this could be a very bad moment. He slid his hand farther up my thigh, and after this, I'm not even really sure what happened next. I just remember slamming my fist into the glass window, and it popping all over me. I know I must have gotten the door open somehow too, because after some time, the headlights were behind me and I was running down the road. The predator that this guy was terrifying, and apparently he had a gun under his seat. I saw him pull it out and raise the gun toward me. Luckily, I don't think he ever shot, because I'm still here today. But I ran and ran and ran until I found the nearest place with the payphone and called my parents. I never hitchhiked after that, and I learned a very valuable lesson that night. The Dangers of Hitchhiking by Sarah's Closet. I am now a 39-year-old female. And many, many moons ago, sometime between the ages of 15 and 17, when it was still the 90s, another girl and I used to hitchhike cross-country. When we first went on our little adventure, it never even crossed our minds that we might one day need some form of weapon on us for self-defense. So it was a long time before we got one, and this is a story of 2 instances before that time when we would have been in much better positions if we had a weapon. The first one was in Pueblo, Colorado. We were sitting at a gas station contemplating walking up to the highway when the random guy told us that he couldn't take us anywhere, but if we were willing to cook, he'd take us home and feed us and let us shower, etc. While an offer like this may be a red flag for most people, this was well into our time hitchhiking and relatively common. We discovered that the people that didn't converse much were the ones we should usually be worried about. This guy didn't say hardly anything the entire way there, and Theyre was deep into the wilderness in the middle of the mountains. If you're familiar with Pueblo, you know the hills are far from there. So we were already getting the creeps just knowing how far from civilization we were headed. We finally get there and the guy is giving us both a weird feeling, and we're not okay with this. We agree it isn't a good idea to stay. So less than 5 minutes after arriving at this middle of nowhere cabin in the woods, we tell him we've changed our minds and want to leave. He seems genuinely irritated, but agrees to take us back after some back and forth convincing. By this time we have no clue where we are, or in which direction, and we are both getting pretty worried. And as we venture out into the woods again, we begin discussing with one another. The fact that it feels like it's taking longer to get back than it did to get there was really setting off alarms. We both start wondering if we are going back or maybe we're going further into the wilderness. And to make it even worse, we have not spotted even one other passing vehicle this entire time. Nobody was heading in the direction that we were. So now the conversation is going towards what we might do if he's leading us further into the woods. We both agree that since there are 2 of us and only 1 of him, even if we are both beginning to panic and sweat, we can probably wait this out or take him if it needs be. Although this was still over 20 years ago, it feels like it took twice as long to return as it did to make it there. We did eventually make it back to the gas station we started at. He let us out, and we went on our way. The second instance was just outside of Sacramento, California. We had been traveling with a big fat trucker who was not conversational at all. Even as much as we tried prompting him to talk to us, he had little or nothing to say. We had been traveling in his truck for a few hours and we both had fallen asleep. Until my travel companion abruptly awakened me, the car had stopped on the side of the highway, and my friend was adamant about us exiting the vehicle immediately. So I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that she had been awakened by the truck driver feeling her breasts in her sleep. She said his exact words were,
"After all I've done for you, you can't even let me cop a feel."
So we got out of the truck, literally ran on the side of the highway, somewhere near Sacramento, but we walked away unharmed and almost entirely unviolated. And amazingly enough, out of nearly 3 years of hitchhiking cross-country together, those were the only 2 times anything remotely scary happened to us, and it was the best time of my entire life still to this day. The Hitchhiker Murders by Anonymous. Sonoma County, California is one of the most agriculturally productive areas in the entire country. It produces a massive amount of hops, grapes, prunes, apples, dairy, and poultry products every single year. This is down to the vast swaths of fertile land and the abundance of high-quality irrigation water. In addition to the vineyards and wineries that all call Sonoma home, one might mistake the county for being a little slice of paradise. But during the early 1970s, a series of horrifying events in the hills around Sonoma's largest city, Santa Rosa, would make this heavenly place seem more like a circle of hell. On February 4th, 1972, 2 middle school friends were returning from a visit to the Redwood Empire Ice Arena. Maureen, Louise Sterling, and Yvonne Lisa Weber, 12 years old, were last seen around 9 p.m. hitchhiking on Guerneville Road, northwest of Santa Rosa. Neither of the girls arrived home that night. The parents begged local authorities to find their girls, and find them they did. Their bodies were found December 28th, just a few miles north of Franz Valley. A single earring, orange beads, and a 14-karat gold necklace with a cross were found at the scene. The cause of death could not be determined from the skeletal remains. Then just a month later, 19-year-old student Kim Wendy Allen was given a ride by two men on the evening of March 4th, 1972. They last saw her approximately 5:20 p.m., hitchhiking to school and carrying a large wooden soy barrel with red Chinese characters. Her body was found the following day down an embankment in a creek bed. The two men who gave her a ride, one of whom was presented and passed a polygraph test, were ruled out as suspects. These hitchhiker murders were repeated as the years went by, but only a handful had a modus operandi that matched the previous murders. One in particular had an alarming additional detail that may shed some light on who the murderer or murderers were. Carolyn Nadine Davis, 14 years old, ran away from her home outside of Anderson in Shasta County on February 6, 1973, but disappeared on July 15th after being dropped off by her grandmother at the Garberville post office. She was last seen hitchhiking that afternoon near the highway in Garberville. Her body was discovered on July 31st, just meters from where the remains of Sterling and Weber had been found 7 months prior. However, this time the cause of death would be determined. Coroners stated that it was an apparent cause of strychnine poisoning, 10 to 14 days before the body was discovered. A witchcraft symbol meaning carrier of spirits was found by her body. As was previously mentioned, an additional 8 unsolved murders of female victims who have been linked to the unknown murderer, and all happen to be hitchhikers. Yet, not a single conviction has ever been handed down in the connection with any of them. However, that doesn't mean there aren't a few prevailing theories on the murderer's true identity. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr., the Hillside Stranglers of Los Angeles, were seriously considered suspects. The Hillside Strangler murders began with the deaths of 3 sex workers who were found strangled and dumped naked on hillsides northeast of Los Angeles between October and early November 1977. It was not until the deaths of 5 young women who were not sex workers but girls who had been abducted from middle-class neighborhoods that the media attention and subsequent Hillside Strangler moniker became prominent. However, there was insufficient evidence linking Bianchi or Buono to the Sonoma County murders, so we must look elsewhere for conclusive proof. Another suspect in this case was Frederick Manali, a 41-year-old Santa Rosa Junior College creative writing instructor. In August of 1976, Manali was involved in a fatal head-on collision on Highway 12. As CHP officers cleared the scene, they discovered something alarming. In addition to a large amount of creative writing work Manali had in his possession, police found that the instructor cultivated another form of creative drawing. But these weren't still life or landscape drawings, no. These were scenes depicting sadomasochistic acts committed by a young woman. Investigators were quickly able to identify the woman in question from the quality of the sketches. It was Kim Wendy Allen, the second victim in the series of murders. Yet, despite searches of Manali's home, investigators could not find a credible link between the sketches and the murders. Another suspect in this case was none other than the subject of a recent Netflix-made movie, Ted Bundy. After the prolific murderer's capture for similar crimes in Washington, Colorado, Utah, Florida, and Idaho, Ted Bundy was heavily suspected as the Sonoma County hitchhiker killer. The links between the naked bodies of the Sonoma victims and the extreme venereal nature of Bundy's crimes were obvious. It turned out that Bundy had apparently spent time in the neighboring Marin County, but was ruled out by a Sonoma County detective in the 1970s and again in the 1980s. This was down to detailed credit card records that reveal Bundy was up in the coast of Washington state on the dates of some of these disappearances. An additional suspect in the murders is another famous name, the Zodiac Killer. Investigators were forced to consider the Zodiac Killer as a possible perpetrator due to similarities between an unknown symbol on his January 29, 1974 exorcist letter to the San Francisco Chronicle, in which he claims 37 victims, and the Chinese characters on the missing soy barrel carried by Kim Allen. Also, the Zodiac had written a letter delivered to the San Francisco Chronicle on November 9, 1969. In it, he intended to vary his modus operandi to confuse detectives and evade capture. "I shall no longer announce to anyone when I commit my murders, and they shall look like routine robberies, killings of anger, and a few fake accidents, etc." Naturally, the consideration of the Zodiac Killer leads us to one Arthur Lee Allen. Alan owned a mobile home at Sunset Trailer Park in Santa Rosa at the times of the murders. He was also fired from his Valley Springs elementary school teaching position for suspected child molestation in 1968. Alan was arrested on September 27, 1974 by the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office and charged with child molestation in an unrelated case involving a young boy. He pleaded guilty on March 14, 1975, and was imprisoned at Atascadero State Hospital until late 1977. This would indeed match the period for some of the murders. What's more, Robert Graysmith, in his book Zodiac Unmasked, claims that a Sonoma County sheriff revealed that chipmunk hairs were found on all of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker victims, and that Alan had been collecting and studying the same species. Since the bodies were dumped outdoors, it would be possible that a few chipmunk hairs might be present on one or two of them, but probably not all of them. Alan was the main suspect in the Zodiac case for over 30 years until his DNA was compared to a partial DNA profile obtained from saliva, recovered on the underside of a postage stamp and envelopes from verified Zodiac letters. Results were a conclusive non-match. Fingerprints and blood retrieved from the taxi cab of Zodiac murder victim Paul Stein, a writer's palm print found on the Zodiac letter of January 29, 1974, and handwriting examples failed to identify Alan as Zodiac. In practice, this evidence would have exonerated Alan should he have ever stood trial for the charges. So we are forced to look elsewhere for clues to the murderer's identity. But given that, almost 50 years later, each murder remains distinctly clear. Just who was murdering hitchhikers in the hills of Santa Rosa? An Unexplainable Hitchhiking Experience by Lucid Lotus. Hey Swamp Dweller, my family has had some insane experiences with the supernatural. We are a family of women with psychic abilities and men that have just had some crazy, unexplainable occurrences. Today I wanted to share a story with you and your followers. Something that did not happen to me but to my uncle. He didn't use the internet often, and didn't even know how to get his story out there, so I'm submitting it on his behalf. Without further ado, this story takes place in Canada, specifically on the outskirts of Thunder Bay in the year of 2003. My uncle has always been what most would call a drifter. He was seldom in one spot for too long and would get around by hitchhiking. Christmas of 2002 leading into January of 2003, my uncle had traveled from Regina to Ontario to spend the holidays with our family. We were all located in Ontario. As the holiday season passed, he returned to Regina in the most typical fashion, hitchhiking. He had an uneventful trip until he made it to Thunder Bay. He was dropped off by a transport trucker on a lonely highway outside of Thunder Bay as far as the trucker could take him. He had wandered further and further down the highway with rarely any vehicles passing. None willing to stop and give him a ride. It was between 2 and 3 a.m. and he was frozen and started to slow his pace and take a lot of breaks along the way. He ended up standing in one spot for quite some time to try to warm himself and conserve energy. It was under a street light, and his particular area was well lit. Suddenly, he heard branches snapping behind him in the tree line, about a half a football field length away. He chalked it up to a deer or a moose, as the deep Canadian forest is full of wildlife that is quite active at night. He then heard what sounded like a groaning sound, muffled and almost sounded human, but not quite. He decided to continue walking and would speed up his pace between streetlights because he just had an eerie feeling something was wrong, and he felt something in the pit of his stomach. He could hear whatever this was in the tree line following him as he moved, but it seemed to remain in the tree line. Branches cracked, and between cracks he could hear grunts and groans. Then it hit him. The grotesque smell of raw meat that had been baking in the sun mixed with that smell of sewage. He could see a moving figure that was almost white, with patchy fur. He had never been so afraid in his whole life. With no way to call for help, and the isolating feeling brought on by the realization that not a single vehicle had passed in hours, he felt helpless and feared for his life. He tried to keep moving. Faster and faster, the creature kept his pace and remained in the tree line, almost as if it was playing with him. He stopped as he approached the last light on the street. This stretch of highway did not have many more lights after this, and the ones that were after this didn't seemingly work. He felt the most fear he had ever felt in his life at this point. The streetlight's dim light was the only sense of safety he could grasp, and now, it was utterly gone. He turned to face the tree line and noticed that he couldn't see or hear anything, and thought the creature had maybe given up on him as prey. He almost sighed a breath of relief before hearing a branch snap directly in front of him. What came next has stuck with him. A shriek so loud and shrill that it made his entire body freeze up, rendering him in shock paralysis. Thankfully, headlights approached and came to a halt beside him. He hadn't even noticed the truck come near his way. He didn't even have the capacity to turn and try to catch a ride. He was still paralyzed with fear. It was a lovely man in a large black Jeep. The gentleman screamed at my uncle to get in the vehicle. He did not protest and jumped right in. Naturally, not his first instinct, as he prefers to get a feel for the person before just jumping in a car, but the man had a tone of urgency and fear, and my uncle didn't want to be a meal for whatever the hell that creature was. As soon as my uncle jumped into the Jeep, the man sped off and then parked about 20 minutes up the road and explained to my uncle what he had seen when he was approaching him on the highway. My uncle was grateful to the man. Whatever he had seen, based on the description in my uncle's in-depth research of cryptids following this experience, they all believed that it may have been some sort of Wendigo, or something of that nature. I'm just glad he wasn't a victim of a Wendigo attack. The Thing from the Woods by Jeffrey D. I was on my back porch with a newly lit cigar resting on my lip. I was relaxing to the ambience of crickets chirping and wind blowing. My loyal dog Kane by my side. He was the best pit bull I have ever had. Then, as my cigar was almost burnt out, I saw his ears perk up, and not long after he started barking. Barking louder and more menacing than I'd ever heard from him. He was barking at something on the other side of the barbed wire fence. I heard a noise I wasn't very familiar with, but it sounded like me. I thought, as I grabbed my 12-gauge single shotgun. As I cracked it open, I walked back outside after chambering a shell and realizing that Kane was no longer barking. He was out of sight and the crickets weren't chirping either. There was no longer a light breeze. It was purely silent. I walked down the porch steps and called out for him, noticing a trail of blood. I saw that night was approaching quickly and I knew that I had no time to find my dog. I trailed off into the woods, cracking my gun closed, stepping over the barbed wire fence, knowing that whatever my dog had been chasing after couldn't have been too far. I chased off into the woods, calling for Kane. Knowing these woods like the back of my hand, I realized that the trail of blood had stopped, and when I looked up, I had no idea where I was. I didn't recognize anything in sight. Still, I was searching endlessly for my boy. I called out once more, "Kane! Kane!" I yelled, only realizing that I had finally heard something. Something familiar. It was my dog. He was barking and growling, but only it was different. It sounded distorted like an old record player. I knew whatever was making that noise was not Kane. I continued into the now moonlit woods. I heard a branch snap, rustling behind me from the tree line, and I began to spin around quickly, only to find that there was nothing there. I looked around, and then suddenly I noticed that I was face to face with, well, myself. Whatever this was trying to mimic me, that's for sure, but it just looked wrong. It had my face, but it was almost inhuman. I called out for my dog once more to see if I could find his direction, and then I heard it copying me, saying the same things I were in a distorted voice. Its tone was just slightly off though, distorted and delayed. I heard shuffling next to me after I was running. I listened to my loyal dog Kane burst through the bushes next to me, but there was another Kane. When I looked down next to him, it was almost like a mirror image, but again, like it was distorted and not real. Realizing now that I'm not only lost in the woods, but I have no idea what direction to go in, I'm stuck with something that can apparently mirror our image and we don't know what it actually looks like at all. So I try to keep my cool and I began to run in the direction that I thought my house was. After a couple of minutes of me and my dog running side by side at what felt like full speed, we broke through the tree line and busted out to the back door. I've never been more nervous in my life. I have no idea what it was, how I got lost, or how I seemingly knew where to go to get out of there. What I can say is that I don't want to have to deal with that ever again, so I'm not exploring the woods after dark ever again. Strange Experiences in New York by Anonymous. This takes place in New York, not the city. I'm from upstate. There are a lot of woods for being the state with a vast city. My story starts with me going to my grandma's property. She owns around 100 acres of wooded and cropped land. It was a sunny and pleasant day. Not too cold, not too hot. The perfect day to go metal detecting. I was wandering around in the woods like I always do, just trying to find some buried treasure. The only prize I found this day were some nails and a horseshoe. I never saw anything unsettling, and only a few weird and scary things on this plot of land ever really happened to me. So I didn't think I was in any danger until the telltale signs of something showed up. I noticed the woods went silent. I could only hear the podcast I was listening to in my headphones and my footsteps, so I turned off my phone, looked around, and listened to very fast rustling in the trees and leaves on the ground. I got a little scared, but I was in the woods. It could be literally anything. I picked up my shovel, which is a military-style shovel. This creature was still zooming by and around me until it blindsided me and took a nice piece out of my leg, but I also got a good hit on him. My crash sent him scurrying to the ground, and once it gathered itself, it looked at me with these big red eyes, and then, to my horror, it stands on two legs. I'm scared out of my mind. I cannot get my wits together. I'm going to try to describe this monster to the best of my ability. It was roughly around 5 foot tall, maybe even only 4'9". It had large eyes and knee-length arm, and legs compared to its height. It was built like a bodybuilder. It closely resembled a buff lemur, just at a colossal size. It was covered head to toe with dark reddish-brown hair, and claws on its legs and feet about 2 inches long, if I had to guess. The damage they did to my leg was sharp as all hell. I've seen and learned a lot about cryptids in the works, but the only thing I can classify this creature is a devil monkey. But I never thought that they would be here in New York. It just stood there, sizing me up, until it suddenly lunges at me with incredible speed. I got lucky, though, and put the shovel to my head and blocked its attacks before it could take my head off. At this moment, I realized this thing was not trying to scare me away. It was going for the kill, so I lunged at this creature and hit him over the head as hard as I could. My arms felt numb after hitting it. It put him in the ground hard where it didn't get up for a few seconds, and gave me the time to run. After gathering my thoughts and calming down a little bit, I managed to gather my things up. And when I realized that the woods were still silent, I ran as fast as my injured leg would take me. I could not tell if I heard my own footsteps or if there were more of them. I kept running until I was out in an open field where the footsteps stopped and I could chill out for a second. I later called my mom and dad to get me where I was, and they took me to a hospital and got the whole rundown of tests and repairs. When I was questioned about what happened, I had to make up some crazy story about me getting lost and tripping over stuff. But, honestly, I still to this day believe I had an encounter, or I guess a battle, with a devil monkey. Why I Hate the Outdoors by Anonymous. I'm not much of an outdoors kind of guy. I've always preferred to be inside most of the time. This happened 4 days ago. I was at my friend Greg's house. It was Monday morning in the middle of summer, bright and hot. We were inside playing on his gaming console. His mom was cooking breakfast in the kitchen. His dad had left for work already, but had only been gone for a few minutes before we got up. The sweet smell of scrambled eggs with some bacon and toast filled the air. We were your average 15-year-old boys, hoodies with ripped jeans and Nike shoes. "You suck at this game, Isaac," he remarked. "It's not like I sit here 24/7 playing video games all day," I said. Greg's sister soon woke up and came down the stairs. "Don't tell me you guys are up at 8 a.m. in the morning playing video games," she said. "How about you go back upstairs and play with your Barbie dolls?" Greg said. Shut up, Greg. You know I'm too old for dolls, she said. Isaac, Greg, Wendy, breakfast is ready, Greg's mom said. We all ran into the kitchen and made our plates. As we were eating, Greg's mom said, Your sister and I are going to Uncle Dan's house today. Would you two like to come? She asked. No thanks, Mom. Me and Isaac are going to stay here today, he responded. Okay, don't get into any trouble while we are gone, she said. When we were all finished eating, Wendy and Greg's mom got their stuff together and left. Greg and I decided to play video games until they got back. While playing, Greg's mom called us and told us that she and Wendy would be staying the night at Uncle Dan's house, and Greg's dad won't be home until around 5 a.m. She trusted us to stay alone all day and night. We could do whatever we wanted. We decided to play video games all day. Who would be there to stop us? After about 5 hours of playing, sometime around 1 p.m., we got bored playing video games. We decided to go for a walk outside. We got out of the house and began walking down the street. There were so many cracks in the sidewalk, I'm surprised we didn't fall. We kept walking down the cracked sidewalk. Hey Isaac, looks like there's a trail over there through the woods. You want to walk down that instead? The trail was right beside a children's playground that led deep into these tall pine woods. Why would you even think about going in there? I asked. It's fine, it's not dark out yet. And besides, I just saw 2 kids on bikes right in there, he spoke. Okay, fine, I'll go, but you owe me $5 when we get back, I spoke. Deal, he replied. As we made our way up to the trail entrance, we looked at the giant pine trees towering. There was a sign that read, Pinewood Trail. We made our way onto the trail and began our walk. You could hear birds chirping and the leaves rustling in the wind. It's peaceful out here, I said. No kidding, he replied. We kept walking for what felt like minutes. We were at least a mile into the trail when we spotted a deer off in the distance. Wow, that's a huge deer, Greg said. I wasn't all that intrigued, though. I was more focused on a particular sound I had heard. I swear, I heard a tiny whisper in my left ear. The sound of a woman's voice.
Isaac.
That's all I could make out. I turned around and saw nothing. You okay, bro? Greg asked. Yeah, I'm fine, I replied. We continued walking farther and farther into the trail. As we continued down the path, I couldn't help but notice that it sounded like the wind was calling out to me.
Isaac, turn back now before it finds you.
I started to get freaked out. Greg, can we head back now? I asked. Why do you want to leave already? He asked. I don't know, man. This place just gives me the chills, I replied. Are you scared the boogeyman's gonna get you? He replied. Seriously, dude, can we turn back? I asked. After like maybe 2 more miles, he replied. Okay, just make it quick. While walking, I caught a glimpse of what I could make out to be a woman in black and white. It looked like she had a jacket and blue jeans on. Hello? I called out, and I got no response. She began to walk away and soon disappeared behind a tree. Who are you talking to? Greg asked. I thought I saw someone, I replied. It's probably just another person walking the trail, Greg said. We continued down the trail further. Once we finished walking those 2 extra miles, Greg and I decided to head back. As we were heading back, we could see the sun begin to set behind the top of the trees, and we started walking a little bit faster. As we were walking, I thought I caught a silhouette out of the corner of my eye, but I ignored it and kept walking towards the trail entrance. It was dark by this point and I could barely see anything around me. Good thing we had our phones on us and we turned on the flashlights and kept walking. Over the sounds of our footsteps, I heard a faint growl come from behind me. In the woods to my right, there was something there. I stopped. Greg, did you hear that? I asked. Yeah, I heard it, he replied. Do you think it was a bear or something? I asked. I don't know, but whatever it was, I don't want to meet it, he replied. While talking, a bear-like roar interrupted us. We both screamed and ran in the opposite direction. While running, I shined my flashlight at it. What I saw was absolutely horrifying. It was a pale creature, with no fur and no clothes. It was bald and had deep red eyes. It stood about 8 feet tall and had a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. I screamed to Greg, "That is not a bear!" I shouted. He looked back and screamed. We were beginning to run out of breath until I saw a set of bushes. We tried to hide in them. We turned off our phone flashlights and hid. We could hear the thing sniffing out for us. As it made its way toward the bush we were hiding in, we prayed that it would not find us. Then it let out that same roar we had heard earlier and ran off. "What was that thing, Greg?" I asked. "I don't know, but we need to get the heck out of these woods ASAP," he said. We got out of the bush and looked around. It was nowhere to be seen. As we made our way out of the bush and back to where we came from, I could hear that same voice again.
Go. Follow the animals. They will show you the way.
I saw a little blue jay up in the tree. I signaled for Greg to follow me. As I followed the blue jay, I could still hear the creature far off. I could still barely see anything, just the light of the full moon, but that barely even made it through the leaves of the trees. We had finally made it back to the trail. We continued down the path that we took to get there. We could see the entrance. It was right up ahead. That's when the creature stepped in front of the door. We ducked behind a large tree in hopes that we could hide from it. It began to walk toward us. Its heavy footsteps echoed through the woods as it marched its way to us. It was about 5 feet away from the tree I was standing behind. Greg was behind the tree right next to me. It had grabbed onto the tree I was standing behind. It peeked its head around the tree and it almost saw me, until it backed off and suddenly disappeared into the woods again. Greg and I made a run for it out of the trail. We ran straight home without stopping. I don't know how to explain this experience. I have no idea what it was, but it's downright the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced, and why you will never catch me in those woods ever again. The Strangest Thing I've Seen in the Woods by Anonymous. Hello, Swamp Dweller. I love your work, and listening to it constantly reminds me of an event that happened a couple of years ago that changed my view on the world and the threats it hides. I want to say I'm not begging people to believe me. Honestly, I don't really care if you do. I know what I went through that night, and I don't need people to cast their judgment. Anyway, I will be referring to myself as Josh and my friend as Jay to protect us from public attention. For some background, I joined the armed forces back in 2017 and completed my infantry training in 2018. After training, I was transferred to my unit and met one of my most trusted friends, Jay. Jay is your typical military type, robust, aggressive, and tuned into the job's core and requirements. As for me, I'm more of a middleman. I tend not to stand out for better or worse, as I like to keep myself to myself. So in 2020, my company, which is made up of 2 platoons, deployed on a 6-day training exercise in a woodblock. This is a military-owned forest to train in defense and ambush operation. The first couple of days were wet and absolutely miserable, so Jay and I constantly purging, which is complaining to each other. On the 4th day, at 1800 hours, the 2 platoons split up to conduct night navigations in different areas of the vast training forest. So after we conducted our evening routine, such as eating our rations and making hot drinks to last the night and powdering our feet, we gathered with the rest of the platoon. It's around 20 troops, on a dirt road where military rented Land Rovers that were waiting for us with night lights, maps, and coordinates for the night navigation. Lads, get into pairs with someone. I don't care who you're partnering with. Just get here and hurry up. We all shuffled, and Jay and I stood side by side and exchanged a confident look. He was the best at navigation in our platoon, so I know we would be back to the administration point before it was too late. More sleep for us, right? Check this out. It's only 5 points. Should be easy, Jay said with a confident smile on his face. Yeah, you up for running around so we can get back early and get more sleep for tomorrow's ambush? I asked. Oh, definitely, man. Let's smash it, said Jay. Around an hour later, we grabbed our Sax belt kit and set off running towards the 3rd marker, which was close. Due to there still being light out, we decided to ignore using our night sights on our helmets. Within the first hour, we had already done most of the checkpoint and were feeling buzzed, although I began to feel fatigue. So I asked Jay if we could rest for roughly 10 minutes. Yeah, man, I'm exhausted. Let's have a water break, said Jay. We walked into the woodblock and dropped our kit as we sat upon the trees. Once we were comfortable, I realized how dark it really was. I couldn't even see my friend sitting about 5 centimeters in front of me. So I turned on my torch, and we started pulling out our snacks and water bottles. I think the next point is less than a kilometer in this bearing. Jay began, when he suddenly stopped talking. "What's wrong, man?" I asked, but he placed a finger on his lips and pointed at my light, and I immediately turned it off and sat there in the pitch-black woods, confused, until I heard it, snapping branches off to our right in the distance. I also realized the forest was now utterly silent. When the bugs and animals go quiet, a predator is usually nearby. Panic started to set upon me, and I began to pant as I heard the snapping of branches get louder, signifying that whatever was moving was getting closer.
Hey, who's that?
Jay shouted in the direction the noises were coming from. No answer came back except for the lack of noise, as if whatever or whoever it was had stopped moving entirely. I realized that it was most likely one of my fellow soldiers, so I shouted, "Hello? Who is that?" hoping for a fellow soldier to call something back, but nothing. I looked at Jay and said, "We should take off. I want to get this over with rather than catch up with whoever that is." Jay agreed, so we packed up and turned on our night vision, which was rather useless due to the lack of UV light in the dense woods. With every tree branch hitting me as I moved, it felt like a million people were poking me all over my body. I looked down to avoid getting poked in the eye and kept walking forward. After about 20 meters of moving, I look up to see Jay standing completely still in an opening of trees. He stopped me with one of his arms and said, "Why are..." He cupped his hand over my mouth and whispered, "Shh, listen." I heard a rapid snapping of twigs and branches in the direction we had come from, as if whoever it was running full sprint through the woods toward us. This full-on scared me, as I know for a fact that no one would run through something that dense for fear of injury. Let me tell you, getting poked in the face or ribs by sharp branches freaking hurts and can even impale you. So I couldn't understand why whoever it was would do that to themselves just to freak us out. After around a minute of listening to the person running towards us, they got about 10 meters away, they abruptly stopped. I tried focusing my night sight, but I couldn't see anything past the tree slightly in front of me due to the lack of UV light. "Guys, stop messing around. We're not helping you with your nav points," shouted Jay. And a couple of seconds went by, which felt like minutes. I honestly felt like I had a panic attack. My chest was tight, my breath was shallow but rapid, and cold sweat oozed down my face, washing the camouflage cream straight off. Jay suddenly yanks my arm and says, "Let's get out of here. Whatever happened right now, prank or not, is freaking me the F out." Bear in mind, this guy is about 210 pounds, 6'2", and built like a brick wall, and despite how dark it was, I could make out he was pale as a ghost. So I agreed. As soon as we began to jog through this clearing in the trees toward the dirt road that ran into a coral line with the woodblock, we heard an extra pair of steps moving a lot faster than we were, as if whoever it was trying to close the distance between us. I turned around but still couldn't see a damn thing, so I shouted, "Dude, we have to get out of here." And Jay, without saying anything, began full sprinting down the clearing, with me struggling to keep up. After 40 meters or so, we exited the road and stopped with a sigh of relief, but the sound of running steps made us explode into another sprint. We ran around for a mile, completely missing the checkpoint we were meant to get. There was no way we were stopping to get that, and eventually we had to stop to rest and catch a breath. We heard nothing at all. No running, no bugs, no branches snapping, absolutely nothing but silence. We stood there gasping for air when a loud thud sound echoed out, followed by what sounded like someone dropping a sandbag on a pile of sticks. I see Jay on the ground. I fall to my knees to check on him. I thought he had passed out. I felt a pouring of liquid on his face running over my hands. Without thinking, I pulled out my flashlight, flipped up my night sight, and turned it on to see blood all over my hands, soaking into my sleeves as well as the earth around where Jay's face was. I shined the light in his face to see blood pouring from his nose. I quickly examined his nose to see a vast open gash in the center. "Jay, what the hell, man? You should have told me you were feeling faint." I look a little to the right and see a blood-soaked rock the size of my hand a couple of centimeters from where I was kneeling. I realized that rock was what hit him. I immediately stood up, filled with rage, and screamed, "Hey, I don't know who keeps messing with us, but you just injured Jay, you freaking idiot." But I heard nothing in return. "Come on now, or I'll freaking kill you." There was still nothing. Then I began to put the pieces together. Someone had chased us for miles and then just attacked us with a rock, which means they're incredibly close and are watching us. I began to use the torch to scan the arcs, but I couldn't see anyone hiding to my left or right in the woods. I start to panic and look down to check on Jay. I now only realize that he's unconscious. Oh God, is all I can mutter. I can see my breath, and it's getting very cold. I'm stuck with my unconscious friend while some sicko is practically hunting us and is just watching and waiting to see what I do next. I slowly unclip my survival knife from my belt kit, flip it open, and begin to scan my arcs more slowly so that I don't miss anything. After thoroughly scanning the woodline to my right and some of my left, I see it, a yellowish dot next to a tree. At first, I just stared at it in confusion until it quickly disappeared and reappeared. Something, or someone, just blinked. I panicked and dropped my torch and began shaking Jay to wake him up. Feeling a small puddle, most likely blood, hit my knees as I fell next to his head. In the flash of an instinct, I reached for his water bottle and began pouring water on his forehead to try and shock him into waking up. I looked over to see the yellow semicircles hovering at least 7 feet from the ground. It was getting closer. I picked up my knife and held it tight in my right hand while tapping Jay's cheek with my other, not once looking away from whatever this thing was. I could make out that it was slowly approaching from the tree. It was like it was savoring the moment. Suddenly I felt movement from Jay as he began waking up, but I dared not look down at him. Jay, you conscious? I whispered. What's happening? My face is killing me. He groans while he sluggishly starts to move around on the floor. Jay, get the F up right now, man. We don't have time to mess around. We're both going to get hurt or die. I don't know what's happening, just follow me. I gasped. Okay, I'm moving. He said with a sense of weakness as if he was still waking up. Jay, you need to run up the road as fast as you can and I'll be right behind you. I paused. Go, I yelled, and he crawled to his feet and began sluggishly shuffling away. I stared at something that just gave off the sense of death. I could no longer tell if it was moving or standing still due to a huge tree, not partially blocking my full view of it. I could only see one eye glowing at the brim of my light. I used my hand to scan the ground for my light. After a couple of agonizing seconds, I left it and lifted up and moved it directly into this thing's face. What I saw still messes with my head. I can't understand it. This was a tall humanoid, with gray skin, yellow eyes, no hair, and no ears. The sight of it chases me through my nightmares to this day. A split second was all it took for me to put into fight or flight mode, and I chose flight out of the sense of survival. I ran, knife and torch in hand. I ran for what I felt like was miles, but I couldn't tell you actually how long it was. This is an 18-mile woodblock radius. I eventually got into a civilian-used road. I kept running until a military troop transport slammed its brakes and my platoon sergeant and the platoon medic grabbed me and forced me onto the back of the vehicle. I can't remember falling asleep, just waking up in a hospital bed. I was apparently pulled out of the field and taken to the nearest military base's medical center for aid. After being debriefed by the medical personnel and having cuts and bruises all over myself plus high blood pressure, I was given 24-hour bed rest before dealing with the consequences of going AWOL whilst on duty. Camping in Nicollet National Forest by Luke H. A little background. Everyone probably says that same thing. I'm an avid outdoorsman. I hunt, fish, camp, hike, and kayak. My buddy is not an outdoorsman. He goes party camping with me, and that's about it. We have never experienced anything like what I'm about to tell you, and this happened back in 2018. The day before, we were camping at a lake in the Nicollet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. The trees were changing color, and the leaves were starting to fall. It was freezing at night, being October. My buddy got cold quickly and we drove around in the mornings to warm up. We would go into town, get gas and supplies, mainly beer. There needed to be more to do at our campground. There was no hiking or activities that currently existed. So, we were drinking, listening to music, and talking about party camping. The next day was going to be an overcast, rainy day, so we decided to spend it driving around, looking at other campgrounds and scouting them for other trips. We partied that night pretty hard and went to bed late. Everything was seemingly normal. We heard wolves, owls, loons, and all the other stuff in between. It was so peaceful. It started raining early the next day. It did just start as a drizzle, but quickly became enough to make camping a pain. We got up late, hungover, and cold. We dressed in our hiking gear, jumped in the car to get warm, and we left the lake campsite a little after noon to check out other campgrounds. It was about 5 miles on to the next one, basically on the highway with no privacy. We would generally check them out, but it started raining very hard. We stayed in the car, marking down the campsites we liked and the ones we didn't. This one we didn't very much like. Now, the thing about this national forest is there are campsites and campgrounds spread out absolutely everywhere. They are all connected to my knowledge, so you have to get on the highway, find a little sign that says campsites this way, and drive down a dirt road for about 10 to 15 minutes to find them. We made it there around 8 before 5 o'clock. We were at the entrance of what was going to be our last one for the day. It said the road was about 15 miles. I went slowly, not trying to kick up many rocks into my car. The road was pretty eerie. The trees made the street look like we were going down into a cave. A couple of minutes into this drive, the rain had stopped. At the campsites, there was no one there. It was beginning to get dark, and we had been in the car all freaking day, so we were ready to get out, stretch our legs, and at least move around just a bit before we got back in there. We parked at the first campsite and got out. The birds were singing their lullabies and everything was still. There were 5 campsites in the circular clearing with thick trees all around. The sites were open to each other all around and not really ideal for camping unless you rented all the sites. We walked around the circle and noticed a sign that said group camp pointing up a trail. We started going down the gravel path full of wet leaves to the site. After walking for some time, I realized it wasn't very close. I raised this concern with my buddy, but we wanted to see the site anyway. It was almost dark out by this point, but we could still see well enough. I noticed the birds had stopped singing at some point. It was hushed, and all we heard was our own footsteps. We made it to the group site after walking for a couple of minutes. It was still. Nothing was moving. We were at the end of the trail looking into the area. The hair on my neck went up and my skin crawled. Something stood up about 30 feet to our left. It was very massive, had dark hair, and was incredibly tall. I was frozen with fear. My body had not noticed and was still walking. I said my friend's name. He must have known something was wrong because he stopped, turned to his left, and was frozen just like I was. I was standing there for what felt like minutes, but couldn't have been more than 30 seconds. I knew what this thing was, but I thought they weren't real. I couldn't speak. Then it started moving towards us. It started yelling some deep, throaty gibberish at us. Against all my instincts to hold my ground and fight back, we absolutely ran for it, and it ran with us. It was still screaming. We kept running for our lives. It was running parallel to us. Its screams were replaced by what I can only describe as a deep, throaty huffing. It was crashing through the dead brush, keeping up effortlessly. We were running, trying not to slip on the leaves or die. We saw the car, and we had hope. As soon as we got to the clearing, it stopped. It hit a tree, more like punched through a tree. We heard a crack and a crash. We were almost to the car when this massive tree hit the ground right next to us. We listened to what can only be described as a great ape beating its chest in triumph while screaming. We jumped in the car and sped away. The rest was a blur. We got back to our campground, packed up, and left in the night. We never spoke about it again and haven't talked about it since. Hiking in the Glades Gone Wrong by Jackson P. The sun hung low in the sky as I ventured deeper into the heart of the Everglades. Towering cypress trees and dense undergrowth surrounded me, casting eerie shadows that danced across the swampy ground. The air was thick with humidity, making every step feel like a struggle. The only sounds were the distant calls of unseen birds and the occasional croak of a frog. I'd always been drawn to the wild and untamed side of life, but today unease gnawed at the edges of my excitement. I consulted my map, my fingers tracing the route I had planned for the day. The trail seemed to grow fainter with every step, and I couldn't shake that feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. The dense foliage blocked out much of the light, and I had to rely on my flashlight to navigate the darkened forest. The shadows grew longer as the day wore on, and a sense of isolation settled over me. I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself that I was an experienced hiker and had faced similar challenges. But this was different, an intangible dread that seemed to seep into the air I was breathing. I paused for a drink of water, my eyes scanning the surroundings warily. I noticed a faint rhythmic sound like the slow, deliberate dripping of water. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from deeper within the swamp, and against my better judgment, I felt compelled to investigate further. Pushing through the thick underbrush, I followed the sound, the ground growing muddier with every step I took. The air was heavy with the pungent smell of decay, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I shuffled forward, my heart in my throat, until I stumbled upon a clearing. What I saw there froze my blood. A grotesque sight met my eyes. A cluster of trees, their gnarled roots intertwined, forming a nightmarish altar. Hanging from the trees were what appeared to be half-decomposed animal carcasses, their lifeless eyes staring blankly into nothingness. The source of the rhythmic dripping was a thick, viscous liquid oozing from the macabre display. A guttural sound, a mix between a growl and a hiss, echoed through the clearing. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and there it was, a creature that defied reason and logic. It stood on two legs like a man, but its skin was slick and molted as if it had emerged from the swamps that it called home. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. My breath caught in my throat as the creature stepped toward me. Panic surged through my veins, and I turned to flee, crashing through the underbrush in a blind terror. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind me, the snapping of branches, the guttural growls. I ran faster than I ever thought was possible. My heart was pounding like a drum in my ears. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I burst out of the dense woods and into an open clearing. Gasping for air, I collapsed, trembling with fear and exhaustion. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but its haunting image was burned into my mind. I stumbled back to civilization, vowing to never return to the Everglades again. That experience still haunts my nightmares. The sense of dread, the eerie sounds, the horrifying creature. Some things are better left undiscovered, and the Everglades holds a secret that is best left undisturbed. Hiking at Night by Anonymous. I'm sorry if this ends up being pretty long. It's not that crazy, but it is a really weird experience that gives me chills. Me and my boyfriend absolutely adore hiking, and there are so many great places to go because of where we live in Oregon. Anyway, we decided to go hiking after 11 p.m. at night at one of the most used trails in our area. We had both been there multiple times throughout our lives, and neither of us ever were concerned about something happening. There was only one thing we were kind of nervous about, and that was the wildfire that had just happened. We parked on the side of the road and walked to the start of the trail. Even though there was a fire, the path was actually very clean and stable. We started walking up the trail when we just started talking about paranormal things like witchcraft and wendigos. I know, this was a terrible move on our side, talking about things of that sort while walking in the woods at night. Now it is to be noted that we both had flashlights, and very good ones at that. We were both being very observant as to where we were on the path. As we got deeper into the conversation, we both realized in just a second that we were not on a trail anymore or anywhere near one. I mean, it was like in a blink of an eye. All of a sudden I remember walking on a trail, and then we weren't. I freaked out and told him we needed to start backtracking. But thankfully he said no, because we couldn't see any trail around us or anything we recognized. I truly believe if we tried to go backtrack, we might not be here writing this today. He told me we needed to start walking up the hill in hopes of getting a better ground and better leverage to be able to see where we were. Maybe we'd be able to see where the path was from the ledge. We walked up for a while, up the hill, and thankfully we popped out on a fire road. We walked all the way down, terrified, and came out on the road about a mile away from where our car was. This is definitely an anticlimactic experience compared to most shared on this channel, but it did freak me out for a moment, thinking that we could die over something so small. But I still wonder, Where the heck did the trail go? How did we get off of it when we were being so diligent about it? Odd Experiences in Yosemite by Edups401. This happened around August this year. I'm not sure what we experienced or if there was anything really paranormal about it, but it's something that I'll never forget. So, this was a hike up to Half Dome. We had a campground about 20 minutes drive away from the trailhead, and the group was composed of me, my uncle, and my uncle's friend, Dee. There were 2 girls with us, but they aren't really relevant to the story. My uncle and his friend are both Christian, so there were no substances consumed that could induce the feeling I will be talking about. We get to our campsite, set up camp, and go to sleep after eating. We plan to wake up at 4 and start the hike by 4:30. I randomly wake up at 3:30 a.m., like completely wide awake, and look out of my hammock. I remember this odd feeling like if I was woken up by something, and I remember looking out at the moonlit scenery. The moon was very bright for some reason this night, and thinking to myself that everything looked like a dream. I lay back in my hammock but can't go back to sleep, and end up waking up my uncle's friend at around 3:50. My uncle asks, "What were you guys doing last night?" I say, "Nothing, why?" He says he woke up for some reason and could hear people walking around, not like an animal, but like a person. I say that's weird and try to brush it off. We get to the trailhead around 4:30, and as everyone is unloading from the car, Dee says he's going to use the bathroom, which there are a couple at the trailhead. I walk behind him for some time before falling behind and waiting for my uncle who forgot something in the car. The short, straight road from the parking lot runs directly into a T intersection with the road to the trailhead, and the bathroom is directly across from the intersection through the field, just a little ways. Those who have been there know what I'm talking about. We get to the intersection and wait for Dee to come out of the bathroom. We wait for what feels like 10 minutes before I go and check. He isn't even in there. I go back to my uncle and tell him about that. He says weird, maybe he went back to the car or something, and we decide to wait just a little bit more. By 5:10 we begin worrying. My uncle goes to check the car again while I'm sitting at the intersection making sure we don't miss him if he went down the road somewhere. My uncle returns and says he's not there. We decide maybe he went up the trailhead without us for some reason and walk up for about 10 minutes. He isn't there either. We're kind of baffled now because there was no other logical place that he could go. I decide to run back and check the car and bathroom again. I meet him halfway before I get to the intersection. He is sweaty and disheveled with a weird look in his eyes. I say, "Where have you been?" He says that he went to the bathroom, and when he got back to the intersection we weren't here. He just assumed we went to the trailhead and started walking, and then met me. I say, "What do you mean, man? We waited at the intersection for over half an hour and checked at the car, the bathroom, the trailhead. You weren't there." He says, "Well, I don't know. I went to the bathroom." He then asks me where my uncle is, and I say at the trailhead. And then he asks me again, and I tell him again. And I note that it's weird because he asked me twice. As we're crossing the bridge to the trailhead, he sees a light off on the riverbank and exclaims, "Oh, maybe that's him." And I just look at him and keep walking. I thought his behavior was very strange, like he wasn't thinking straight. We finally get on with the hike, and it goes by as normal, except that we seem to be losing things, such as my uncle's small red flashlight, one of the girls' gloves, and a water bottle, etc. It's like we just simply forgot about the items and couldn't remember where we could have left them. On the way back, it got dark and we turned on our flashlights, and as we near the end of the hike after the 2 waterfalls, it began to seem like if we'd been walking far too long. "Doesn't it seem like it's taking way longer to get back?" I say to the group, and everybody was just saying they were thinking that. We keep walking, but it still seems like we're not making any progress. I've been on this trail many times and I was walking and I couldn't spot any further landmarks that I remembered. It was weird. There was this odd feeling in the air, a sort of slight menacing feeling. It's hard to describe. I remember thinking, it feels like the woods are alive. We remark 3 or more times about how long the hike is taking and begin to laugh because it honestly felt ridiculous. After a bit, we finally and suddenly find ourselves in the final stretch on the way back to the car. Now all of this seemed odd at the time, but I just brushed it off. I only realized how weird those events were after I sat down and really thought about it. I Killed a Skinwalker by T.W. Grimm. For as long as I can remember, I have had something of a hyperactive imagination. I get lost in extremely vivid daydreams, and I'm not just talking crap when I use the word vivid. I can smell the scents in the air and feel the texture of the objects beneath my fingers. If I eat or drink something, I can taste it. The wind ruffles my hair and the ground is solid beneath my feet. These daydreams are so hyper-realistic, I have trouble discerning where the dream ends and reality begins. This interesting little quirk always came in handy on the long trips my family took to Florida when I was a kid. It's a pretty long way to go, especially when I was just still a squirmy little bobble-headed toddler who absolutely hated flying in airplanes. Even though the journey itself was always a drag, it was always nice to be able to get away from the cold for a while. You start to forget the feel of the heat of the sun on your face, and the endless weeks of gray skies and threatening cloud cover start to drive you crazy. Mom and Dad would work their butts off all year to be able to afford the trip, clocking in overtime and clipping coupons all so we could pack our bags and head off to experience a brief respite from the bitter embrace of Old Man Winter. And it was always worth it. Every single penny. The year I turned 16, my dad decided it would be wise to invest in an RV, which would cut down on our travel cost in the long run. I thought our little house on wheels was the greatest thing I had ever seen. I begged my parents to allow me to live in the RV until it got too cold in the fall, but Mom was not having it. She claimed I would probably sneak in on my friends at night to drink beer and smoke pot, which of course was exactly what would have happened. Mom was no fool. 5 months after Dad first parked the RV in our driveway, we were hitting the frosty highway and rolling south. It was the first time I'd ever seen the countryside between our hometown and our destination on such a close and personal level. And throughout the journey, I was at turns amazed, astounded, and bored to tears. I watched DVDs and lost myself in daydreams to pass the hours away, but by the time we rumbled past the Georgia-Florida state line, I was more than ready to put my feet on solid ground for a while. Flying may be expensive and stressful, but it is a heck of a lot faster. We stopped at a rest station near Lake City to load up on vending machine snacks and pump out the sewage tank. As I was checking out the candy bar selection, a deeply tanned older man in a polo shirt and white cargo shorts came wandering up to join me at the vending machine. He looked like a veteran actor of the big screen, still well built in his middle age and handsome in a generic, all-American kind of way. I looked over at him and thought, this guy could sell a ton of kitchen appliances on the Home Shopping Network. He flashed a pearly white grin and said, "I like those Snickers bars the best. Leave me a couple, would you?" I gave him a dutiful smile in return and started making polite small talk. I learned his name was Devin, and he was some kind of business big shot back in Arizona. I asked if he had come to Florida to do some wheeling and dealing, and my rest stop acquaintance waved the suggestion away with an air of vague annoyance. He said, "Come on now, everyone needs a vacation now and then, and I've been kicking around on this planet for all these years and I've never seen a real, honest-to-goodness swampland. Now, do not get me wrong, the deserts and the plains are pretty damn magnificent, but hell, you gotta get out there and experience new things. You know what I mean? I want to take it all in. I want to sample everything a place like Florida has to offer." Mom yelled at me across the parking lot to hurry up and get my ass in gear, and I realized I had been well on my way to becoming hypnotized by the soothing cadence of Devin's voice. All at once, a small chill skittered down the length of my spine. Something about that grin was making me feel more than a little anxious. I could not help but think that Devin, the businessman from Arizona, wasn't smiling so much as he was baring his pearly white teeth at me. His gaze was just a little too sharp for someone having a casual conversation with a stranger. I felt like I was being studied, categorized, and filed away for future consideration. I took a few steps back and muttered, "Well, I gotta go. Nice meeting you." "Pleasure was all mine, son," he called after me, still smiling. I hurried back to the RV with the strangest feeling that I had just had a near miss with disaster. For the rest of the duration of the drive to the campgrounds, I kept scanning every passing vehicle for a figure with an aggressively friendly slash of a smile beneath eyes that never seemed to blink. I did not see him, but I could not shake the notion that Devin from Arizona was following us. We pulled into the campground shortly before noon. Dad backed the RV into our rented lot and sprang into action, humming the theme to the A-Team as he hooked up the water and the electricity, buzzing around in his electric blue clam digger shorts and matching flip-flops like a tacky little tornado. It was the 3rd week of January, but it was a beautiful 71 degrees outside with a clear blue sky. I could smell the ocean in the breeze and the warmth of the sun's rays against my face. It was intoxicating. When we had pulled out our driveway to hit the road, it had just started snowing again, and it was cold enough to freeze the mucus inside of my nostrils. It felt good to be away from the gray drudgery of ice and slush, even if it only was for a couple of weeks. I blinked up at the sky and felt my earlier anxiety slide off my shoulders. We were finally here, and for the next few weeks, all would be well. Ma and Pa were both pretty bagged from the long day on the road, so we had a mellow day of hanging out beneath the fold-out canopy and roasting hot dogs on our mini-grill. I slept like a rock that night, and when I woke up the next morning, I was raring and ready to do some exploring. My parents had chosen a campground beside one of Florida's many conservation areas that year. I'd been given a new digital camera for my birthday and was excited to use it. Now, keep in mind, this was back in the days before cell phones came equipped with half-decent cameras. In fact, I did not even have a mobile phone yet, and would not for several more years. Mom and Dad popped out of the RV at the last second, and instead they tagged along if only to make sure I did not somehow fall into the jaws of the alligators that lived in the stagnant waters of the swamps. I had been planning to burn a bowl or two behind a cypress tree or something, so I was less than enthusiastic when I heard this news. Mom just gave me a knowing smile and patted me on the top of my head. Once again, my mom was no fool. We wandered into the park and took a map from a display in front of a dilapidated building with a faded sign that proclaimed it to be the Visitors Information Center. I noticed a tall man leaning on the ledge at the open sliding window, chatting with the Parks and Rec worker inside, and I realized with a nasty start that it was none other than Arizona Devin, the vaguely menacing tourist I had met at the rest stop the day before. He appeared to be flirting with the woman working the information booth, and if the entranced expression on her face was any indication, it appeared to be working. Mom grunted. "Come on, kiddo, let's go get eaten alive in this dirty damn swamp." She hauled me away by the arm, Dad stomping along behind us in his mirrored sunglasses and a ridiculous smear of zinc oxide along the length of his nose. My mom managed to convince him to change out the flip-flops, but he refused her demand to not change into another pair of his cringe-inducing clam diggers. They were banana yellow in color, and they flapped around his shins as he walked, which provided enough hilarity for me to almost forget about the unexpected appearance of Mr. Arizona, with his impeccably combed hair and sparkling slash of a grin. Almost, that is. I looked back over my shoulder just in time to see Devin disappearing through the front door of the building, which was being held open for him by the woman from the information booth. She had an expression of rapturous adoration in her face, as if she were completely enthralled by his presence. The door clunked shut, and I found myself slowing to a halt, staring after them, with a strange lump of dread in my stomach. Dad blundered into me from behind and bellowed, "Watch where you're going, dummy!" I'm trying to look at the map here." I scurried away from his irritation and hurried after my mom, who was marching along the trail at a brisk power walker's pace. She snapped, "Hurry up, you two. You both need more exercise. Especially you, Harold. You sit there every night eating those potato chips and watching the TV. And just look at that gut. You're starting to look pregnant." Dad muttered, "Huh, you're a riot, ain't ya?" and shoved the map in his back pocket. Mom militantly marched us along the trail like a drill instructor, hectoring us to keep up the pace, until we finally rebelled and stopped at a footbridge to take some pictures. The footbridge spanned a watery stretch that deepened as it led out into deeper reaches of the swamp. As I looked down into the dark sheen of the sluggish water below our feet, there was a rolling disturbance on the surface, and I caught a brief glimpse of a thick, scaly tail. I tried to snap a quick picture, but the alligator was already gone, leaving only bubbles and ripples in its wake. Dad whistled and said, "Holy moly, that was a big one. I read they don't really attack people very often, but I sure as hell don't want to get too close to one if I could help it." Mom smirked and made a jab about alligators preferring a low-fat diet, which made Dad clench his teeth and shoot back, "You're right. What am I scared of alligators for when I already live with a goddamn harpy?" They started to bicker at each other, and I interrupted by pointedly clearing my throat and grumbling, "Mom, Dad, can you guys just walk ahead of me or something? Argue somewhere I don't gotta hear it, for crying out loud?" Mom snapped, "Why, so you can smoke some pot? Fine, come on Harold, let your pothead son get his fix or whatever he calls it. Let's go." Dad shot me a dark look and growled, "You better not have any dope on you, kid." We drove across state lines. They walked away in a huff, still taking cranky little jabs at each other, and I shook my head as they stomped out of sight. As soon as they were gone, I pulled out my pipe and my bag. Mom was right, of course. I offered my father a silent apology and packed a bowl. The swamp took on an ethereal, dreamlike quality as the THC soaked into my brain. I was still pretty new to smoking pot, and like most beginners, when I got high, I got really high. The smoke hit me like a sack of spongy bricks. Whump. And I was soon blinking out at cypress trees with red eyes and a dopey grin on my face. It struck me that this was an ancient place, fundamentally unchanged for thousands of years. I drifted into a daydream of what life had been for the first human inhabitants. Generation after generation, living and dying within the groves, stalked by panthers and stalking them in turn, dancing around a fire beneath a blaze of stars over the canopy, sweating in syncopated rhythm in the humid air, hunting and fighting and loving and fearing the embrace of death. A hand suddenly descended on my shoulder, making me screech and jump 6 inches in the air. I whirled around and discovered the lady from the Visitors Information Center standing behind me. She let out a strangely mechanical giggle and said, "Whoa, you're a jumpy one, aren't you? I think one of you guys must have dropped this." She handed me a dirty, wrinkled map, the same map my dad stuffed into the back pocket of his hideous shorts earlier in our ill-fated family hike through the park. I took it from her and offered a sheepish apology for littering. She gave me a grin and chirped, "Hey, no problem, accidents happen. Where'd your parents go?" I knew that she could smell the weed in the air. I tried to put on an air of casual unconcern and said, "Oh, they're just up a little way. I trailed off and stared at her with growing unease. There was something about the park lady's grin that was unsettlingly familiar. "I gotta get going," I finished and tried to smile back. "Thanks for picking up the map for us. See ya." I took maybe 5 steps before I was stopped dead by the sound of Devin's voice booming out from behind me. Full of hearty and dark good humor, he said, "I peeked into your head, and I saw it too. The natives and fire, the stars in the night sky, all of it. You have got the sight, kid. I knew from the moment I smelled your scent at the rest stop. A lot of people have a touch of the sight, just a touch, but not like you. In another life, you would have made a great medicine man." I slowly turned around with my heart beating hard in my chest. The lady from the information booth was gone, and Devin stood in her place. He held up a red hairband and said, "That's all I need." A life. A personal item. And there it is. I will own her face for the rest of my years. Pretty neat trick, huh? I gaped at him, too shocked to speak out loud. Finally, I cleared my throat and squeaked. What are you? I mean, holy crap, how did you do that? Devin tucked the hairband in the breast pocket of his shirt and said, well, I guess you could call me a witch. A very specific kind of witch. Folks back home would call me a skinwalker. Personally, I don't like that name very much, but it's what they'd call me. I slowly shook my head, my jaw hanging open in shock, and Devin clicked his tongue in disappointment. It's true. No, I would tell you something. Boy, I'm an old son of a gun. No. I can remember watching Abraham Lincoln roll past in a convoy of horse-drawn buggies. That is how old I am. See this face here? This is not me. I killed this man in the bottom of a gas station years ago. Ate him right up. My real face? Well, you don't ever want to see that, believe me. If I show you my true face, it'll be the last thing you ever see. I could do nothing but shake my head again. I was struggling to keep myself from fainting dead away from fright. Devin beamed at my fear and shook his head in unison with my mute denial. He exclaimed, well, you're going to see for yourself, one way or another. Let us get down to business, partner. I'm a businessman, after all. See, I am tired of kicking around the empty old desert all the time. Everyone needs a vacation now and then. Sure, but me, I need something more substantial than that. Call it a leave of absence, if you will. I want to see the world, but it is not nearly so much fun when you're doing it alone. It would be nice to have a travel buddy or two. I could teach you, kid. I could show you how to be like me. I could teach you how to wear different faces. You could live so long it might as well be forever. What do you think of that? My answer was to abruptly whirl around and start running my ass off. I tried to get off the footbridge as quick as possible. The thing behind me snarled. That was a real bad choice, kid. And heavy footsteps pounded on the splintery old boards behind me. I screamed for help, but the air around me became thick and curiously flat. My voice fell dead inches from my lips.
Ain't nobody gonna help you,
the skinwalker screamed, and in his voice it was so dark and triumphant with hunger, the confident greed of a predator who never fails to secure its prey. I do not know if it was from the extreme stress of the situation at hand, but all at once my mind drifted sideways, and from one footfall to the next I stepped out of reality and into the daydream. The natives were gathered at the other side of the bridge, the ancient one from another time. They looked like they were pissed right off. One of them drew back his bow and uttered a hoarse war cry and let the arrow fly. The stone-tipped projectile whistled past my head and I heard it thunk into my pursuer. It was only a scant moment away from sinking its claws into my back. It let out a jagged screech of surprise and agony. I turned just in time to see a towering, slump-shouldered figure stagger back into a guardrail and flip over to the water below with a tremendous splash. The arrow was protruding from its eye socket. The monstrous thing fought and struggled to the surface. It had time to roar.
I'll eat you alive.
And then a churning commotion boiled in with eerie speed. Several streaks of boiling water and whipping tails from all directions. The skinwalker opened his cavernous mouth to scream again, and it was yanked underneath with tremendous force. There was more gurgled screaming, a lot of flailing of arms and legs, and the water went red with blood. Devin the skinwalker may have been a big deal out there in the deserts of Arizona, but in the watery swamplands of central Florida, the mighty alligator reigned supreme. I stood at the bank and watched as its struggles grew rapidly weaker. When I saw an arm float to the surface, I knew it was done. I started to turn away, but something bobbling in the water caught my eye. I fished it out with a stick and stared at it with horror. I had been hoping The whole incident was just a part of my hyper-realistic daydream, but the dripping hair tie I was holding was very real. I tucked it away in my pocket and whispered, "Tourists gotta watch out for the gators, Devin. Everyone knows that." I was surprised to see the natives from the daydream were still gathered near the end of the bridge. I raised a hand to them, and they returned my greeting, their faces solemn and watchful. One of them pointed to himself, then to me, and then up to the sky. With that, they faded away into nothing before my eyes. I am not completely sure what he was trying to say. Not exactly, but I think I got the gist of it. He was a part of me, and we were both parts of a greater reality. I hurried up to catch my mom and dad before I stepped to throw up into some bushes. My heart was pounding, and my legs were shaking uncontrollably. I felt like I might pass out. I gasped, "Holy crap," and I wiped my mouth with the side of my shirt. Wow, now I know this is a pretty big pill to swallow, but there's still more. After I was finished tossing up my breakfast, I ran ahead on the trail, but I could not find my parents anywhere. I eventually doubled back and found them standing on the bridge, yelling my name at the top of my lungs. Mom freaked the hell out when I came jogging up to them. She said they came sneaking back to the bridge shortly after they'd left in an effort to catch me in the act of smoking my illicit dope, but I was nowhere to be seen. It was almost as if I had disappeared into thin air. Dad spotted what looked like a shoe floating just below the surface, and they both promptly went into hysterics. They thought I actually somehow ended up falling into the water and was eaten alive by gators. I looked down into the water, and there was in fact a shoe bobbing around a few yards away from the bridge. It was one of Devin's spiffy boat shoes, and I was fairly sure there was still a foot inside of it, although I obviously did not share this fact with my parents. It must have broken off during the feeding frenzy. Staring at it made a wave of nausea roll through my guts, and I promptly looked away. I calmed my parents down by telling them that they were right. Being the conniving teenage miscreant that I was, I had tricked them into walking ahead, and that I'd slipped away from the trail to smoke a few bowls because I was a dirty, disrespectful little bastard of a pothead. I stoically endured the rain of slaps delivered by my enraged mother, who had been a mere second away from melting down into a full-blown fit before I came scrambling down the trail. They confiscated my pipe and weed, and Mom declared that I was grounded for the duration of the vacation. No TV, no sightseeing, no fun at all. I pretended to be heartbroken with disappointment, but in reality that was just fine and dandy by me. I just had more than enough excitement to last me quite a while. I overheard my mom and dad talking about the disappearance of a park employee the next day. Dad put forth the possibility that the shoe he had seen in the water may have belonged to her, and Mom, being a true crime fanatic since the early 90s, breathlessly speculated she may have been killed by a jilted ex-boyfriend. I gazed into an open magazine and pretended not to hear the conversation. The shoe had not belonged to the missing park employee, but the hair tie in my pocket certainly did, and I knew the police would never find her body. She had been devoured, whole and screaming, by a monster wearing stolen skin. And then, in an ironic twist of fate, the ancient creature finally got a taste of its own medicine, so to speak, at the jaws of the alligators. Sorry about that. I do not usually like puns, but this one time, I could not resist. As for me, I still have daydreams sometimes, although it is never as vivid and real to me as it was when I was a kid. As the years passed, I found myself doubting the incident, and actually, I thought that maybe I made it up at one point. It seems far more likely that I suffered from some kind of epileptic, petit mal seizures, as kids sometimes do, and the whole thing was just an hallucination or something. Or, so I tell myself anyway. It does not explain the hair tie, nor does it explain the broken arrow shaft floating in the water. I ended up throwing the hair tie out the window as we were heading back home, up the I-95. I didn't want it anymore. Looking at it made me feel weird, and, I don't want to have evidence like that on me. I may have possessed the power of clairvoyance once upon a time, or I may have had a childhood neurological disorder. I cannot say for sure which one is correct, but I can say this. Even monsters need to go on vacation now and then, and when they do, they should probably stay within their element if they know what I mean, because no matter how big and bad a monster you are, there is always something a whole lot worse. I Don't Know What It Was by Demon of Science. Hello, Swamp Dweller. My story may be weird because this is 3 encounters within a week of each other. The first encounter happened back in January of 2021. I had just gotten off work around 9 p.m. and was driving toward my house in a rural part of Kentucky. As I enjoyed the drive home, I was passing along a stretch of the road where it just happened to open up to empty fields, when suddenly I noticed a deer on the side of the fence. It looked mangled, like it had gotten into a fight with a pack of coyotes, but somehow survived. Its fur was all matted, and it looked like it was spitting up blood while hobbling on a broken leg. It just looked horrible. Well, I stopped on the road. I got my phone, ready to dial a friend who worked with the Fish and Wildlife organization here in our hometown, to make sure that, if needed, I could put it out of its misery. They'll come to get it. As I punched in the last part of his number and pulled my pistol out, the deer started moving toward a cattle gate the landowner used to get his truck in and out. Out of the field, the deer looked at me with these glowing red eyes, and then it just started climbing over the gate like a human would, using the gate like a ladder. It swung its leg over the top and hopped back onto all fours. Then, all of a sudden, this smell hit me in the car because my window was down slightly, so I could smoke. It reeked of rotten meat, and something else made my stomach churn. Well, this smell started moving toward my car, and I froze for about 30 seconds, absolutely terrified, before somehow I snapped out of it, shifted my car back into gear, and drove away as fast as I possibly could. Basically, I gunned my engine and was swerving the hell out of there. I blew past all the stop signs that led to my house. I flew down my driveway, knocking up gravel. As soon as I got parked, I ran into my house, telling my roommate what had happened. They laughed it off, like, "Come on, dude, you just imagine that. You work too much and your brain is playing tricks on you." After calming down and catching my breath, I returned to my car to get my backpack and other gear to take inside. I'm closing the trunk and got a whiff of that scent again from my experience, and I began to look around. The damned thing was in the back field, about 40 yards away from me, just staring at me. I bolted back to the house, locked the doors and windows. I grabbed my rifle. I looked at my roommate as they looked out the kitchen window, seeing a quote-unquote deer in the backyard. They didn't say anything as they walked back into the nearby cornfield to the left house. If you're interested in other encounters, I'd love to share more. Thank you for reading this story, Swamp Dweller. Honestly, I know some people might just be saying I was tired, but I can't explain this experience, and it just was no normal deer. A Beast in the Swamp by Braxton P. Living in the southern swamps of Georgia, I've had my fair share of crazy experiences, mostly waking up by strange sounds at night. My name is Braxton, and I'm about to tell you the craziest thing that has ever happened to me. As many people may know, the Okefenokee Swamp is settled in southern Georgia, and most of the alligators are also here. I live in Fargo, Georgia, and our only neighbors are the local wildlife and a state park not too far from here. I'm a father of 3 kids, no older than 4 years old, and expecting a 4th child in about 6 months' time. At 28 years old, I've been married for around 5 years now. Anyway, about 2 weeks ago, I was lying down on the bed with my wife. We weren't asleep quite just yet, and out of nowhere, we heard the strangest thing. I couldn't quite determine what it was, but it was something else that I had never heard before. It was coming from a distance and sounded like a cross between a bear and a primate of some kind. Bears are usually only in North Georgia, so they don't usually prowl around these areas. No, this was something different. After I played some YouTube sounds of black bears, nothing comes close to what we heard, so we had no clue what it was. We used glass fencing about 8 feet tall around our in-ground swimming pool, which is essential to remember because of what happens next. Outside of our window, we have a yellowish dim solar light placed in the pool area. We saw a shadow of something walking by. At first, we thought it was probably just outside of the pool area because there was no way to get into the pool area without going through the house's back door. Not a single gate was installed. The next thing I know, I heard something banging outside of the window, like it was hitting the house. The window is about 8.5 feet off the ground, and the banging was a couple of feet below the window. At this point, I knew this thing had to be around 10 feet tall, if not bigger. I noticed that it walked to the other side of the window as I could only see its shadow. We were both frozen in fear. The last thing that happened was the other noise that it made. It let out a couple of whooping type noises and then disappeared into the night. The following day, I walked out to the pool and saw no trace of a break-in. Nothing was broken, no glass, nothing. Everything was intact. I still don't know how this thing ended up inside the pool area, and I don't know what it was. I was told that I should share this story with someone named Swamp Dweller by a friend, and that he could probably tell me what it was. Something in the Tree Line by Your Local Skinwalker. Well, I've been watching your channel for about a year now, so I finally decided to share this story. I was staying at my cousin's farm for hunting. Now, I was always freaked out about his farm. There was just something about it that made it spine-chilling. But until this story took place, everything was fine, and I never really had any excuse to be scared. So, with that out of the way, let's get on with it. Me and my cousin decided one evening to go out hunting. Not for anything specific, but anything we could shoot and wouldn't get arrested for. When my cousin originally asked me, I was hesitant because I was tired from waking up early that morning. But I decided to go just to get out for the rest of the night and have a fun time with my cousin. I will forever regret that decision, though. Now, you must understand the layout of the pasture and the farm that we were hunting on. It was about 400 acres of flat fields and hills with a creek running through the back half. At the front of the property was a house I was staying at, and at the back corner of the property was a tree line, nothing but miles and miles of woods behind it. Me and my cousin would head for the same tree line. Now, our mode of transportation was an older style, side by side. I usually did the driving, and my cousin was doing the looking. After gathering our equipment and rifles, we eventually set off. The ride up was relatively normal, and we saw a few small possums. With hopes up high, we entered the back section of the pasture near the tree line. I had this sudden and overwhelming feeling of dread and fear. I tried to brush it off and chalked it up to me just being out in the wilderness late in the evening and freaking out. But as we got closer and closer to the tree line, that feeling of dread became more prominent, but again, I really did do my best just to try to brush it off. Eventually, we made it to the tree line. We both hopped out at the side-by-side. We discussed our plan of action. My cousin would walk a few hundred feet into the woods and walk around for a little bit. Well, I would walk around the open field area. As I watched my cousin walk in the woods, that feeling of fear was more prominent than ever. It was almost spine-chilling at this point. I began to have cold sweats, but I never told him for fear of being made fun of. I was around 12 years old then, so being made fun of was something I always ensured would never happen. I decided to hop on the back of the side-by-side, get a can of Coke, and just look at the nice, excellent field and try to soothe my fear and dread. Probably 5 or 6 minutes later, I see my cousin rapidly walking out of the woods. At first, I was confused because he said he'd be there for much longer, but I knew that something must have been up when I saw the look on his face. He looked shaken and frightened, but he just wanted to escape. I was sitting in the passenger seat at the time, not knowing what was happening. He just hopped in the driver's seat and drove off, which was strange because, as I said, I usually did all the driving, and he drove off as fast as he could towards the front entrance of the pasture. When I said, "Dude, what the heck is wrong with you?" he said he heard heavy footsteps a few yards away from him, and they sounded like whatever it was, that it was on 2 legs. I knew there had to be more to what happened, but he seemed genuinely scared and didn't want to talk about it any longer. Now, my cousin is a pretty tough country boy, and he was already, in that macho man stage, and usually he would just run up to whatever anything was and either yell at it or shoot it, He was one of those types of guys. I always looked up to him. He was a few years older than me, a bit taller than me, and I always saw him as a good role model, you know? Later that night, he eventually went home, and I ultimately went to bed. And honestly, I never got him to tell me what it was. I think he saw something like a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or maybe a dog man, I don't know. But I don't want to find out. The Lake Monster Experience by Anonymous. There's something about the Finger Lakes that suggests the possibility of supernatural and mysterious things. Legends and stories abound of hauntings, spirit happenings, utopian communities, ancient ruins, inexplicable phenomena, extraterrestrial visits, and the occasional glimpse of even Sasquatch. Among the most intriguing stories are the numerous reported sightings in the deepest parts of the lake. An aquatic creature, a lake monster if you will. Each of the Finger Lakes has its own personality, of course, but the Lakes Seneca and Cayuga seem to fit within a different, more mysterious category. Their waters are colder, their moods are darker, their waves are bigger. You can travel on boats to and from the sea to these two lakes, and their sheer size seems to hint at the possibility of ancient aquatic megafauna. Native Americans believed Seneca Lake to be a bottomless lake, with a monster that lived within its depths. Almost 40 miles long, deep, and 1 to 3 miles wide, the pitch-black depths of the both, hundreds of feet deeper than sunlight can penetrate, descend to depths below sea level. Reports of monsters in Cayuga Lake were numerous, perhaps even routine in the 1800s. It can be inferred from a story from January 5, 1897, in an edition of the Ithaca Journal. Incredibly, the piece reported that a recent sighting marked the 69th consecutive year in which there was a confirmed encounter with the monster nicknamed Old Greenie. The story went on to recount that the member of the newspaper staff had been living in daily anticipation of Old Greenie's appearance, and had refused reporting assignments that would have taken them near the lake because they were afraid of the monster. The 1897 incident was reported to have been by an Ithaca resident who was driving along the lake's eastern shore and saw what he knew must be the large, long sea serpent. Of course, there were many people trying to debunk it as some sort of tramp or muskrat. Sporadic and isolated reports of the creature would continue until about 1929, when people began reporting not one, but 2 creatures sighted together along the lake's eastern shore. The creatures were described by witnesses as being 12 to 15 feet in length. It was speculated that they might be members of the Seneca Lake sea serpent family that found their way into the local waters through a subterranean channel, which is believed to exist between the 2 lakes. Legends of tunnels connecting Cayuga and Seneca Lakes have circulated for many, many years, which anyone with a rudimentary grasp of the notion of water seeking its own level knows could be possible. Occasional other reports of Old Greenie have certainly been made since then, including a 1974 attack in which a teenage boy apparently had his arm broken and bit by a large eel-like creature, and the local 1979 encounter by a professional diver of a submerged animal 30 to 35 feet in length. Still, all the reported sightings, save one, have been by 1 or 2 persons. The incident with the greatest number of witnesses, and therefore the most credible lake monster encounter, happened on the evening of July 14, 1899 on Seneca Lake. The side-wheeled steamboat, Otetiani, named to evoke the region's Iroquois past, was traveling north toward Geneva from Watkins Glen, with several dozen passengers at about 7 p.m. Sunset was at approximately 8:40, so there was plenty of daylight left, and it had been a sunny and seasonably warm high 79. Somewhere between Dresden, on the west side of the lake, and Willard, on the east side, pilot Frederick Rose reported that approximately 400 yards ahead of the boat was what appeared to be an overturned boat. Captain Carlton Herradine examined the thing with his telescope, later describing its appearance as being 25 feet long with a very sharp bow and long narrow stern. Passengers began to gather. It was a group with some ostensibly credible witnesses, including 2 commissioners of public works, a police commissioner, the manager of the Geneva Telephone Company, and a geology professor. As Captain Herendeen completed his inspection, the pilot signaled the engineer to slow down the boat. The steamboat approached to within 100 yards and lowered a boat to take a closer look. Suddenly, the object turned and began to move away. The captain immediately ordered a full speed ahead. As the thing was moving slowly, the steamboat gained on it easily. The object turned again, this time toward the steamboat, raising its head, looking in the direction of the boat, and opening its mouth, displaying 2 rows of sharp white teeth. Captain Herendeen declared that he would ram the creature and take it alive, if possible. Otherwise, he would kill it and take it aboard or tow it to Geneva. This was the United States in 1899, when conservation of flora and fauna was still kind of fringe. Out west, the bison population, perhaps 10 million in 1850, had been reduced to fewer than 1,000. Passenger pigeons, numbering in the billions in 1860, were on the brink of extinction. And so the boat was turned so that the boat would approach the creature from the side at a ramming speed. The deck of the steamboat was crowded with passengers who were ordered by the captain to put on life preservers. According to the Geneva Gazette, every eye on deck was fixed on the monster and hardly a person was breathing normally. While the boat was yet some distance from it, the monster again looked at the boat, sank out of sight, and the boat passed over the spot where it had been. As the steamboat approached within 50 yards of the creature, the captain gave the order to turn the boat so that its paddle wheel would strike the creature midway between its head and tail. The boat went full steam ahead and struck the monster with enough impact that many of the passengers were thrown off their feet. The mortally wounded animal lay in the water next to the steamboat. It raised its head, gave a sound like a gasp, and lay quiet. Its spinal column had been broken, and it was dead. Lifeboats were immediately lowered, and lines were strung around the body. Passengers and crew tried to secure the carcass. In the end, though, it proved too heavy or unwieldy and dropped into the water, sinking 600 feet to the bottom of Seneca Lake. The ship reached Geneva after dark, and the passengers began to tell their stories of the incident. While all agreed that a monster had been seen, different versions of the length of the monster from 25 feet to as much as 90 feet strained the credibility of the accounts. The Rochester Herald said that Professor George R. Elwood, the geologist on board, who had been in one of the lifeboats trying to secure the body, gave what was considered the most careful and perhaps most trustworthy account. He thought it was a cladastus, an extinct marine lizard from the mosasaur family that lived in what is now the United States until it disappeared from the fossil record at the end of the Cretaceous period, about 66 million years ago. Now, we can't let skepticism get the better of us, considering that in December of 1938, a South African fisherman caught a coelacanth, which is a fish that was thought to have been extinct and disappeared from the fossil record at the end of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago. So it is entirely possible that this thing could have existed. Professor Elwood went on to describe the creature as about 25 feet long, with a tail that tapered until within about 5 feet of the head, which it broadened out and looked much more like a whale. The creature weighed about 1,000 pounds. Its head was perhaps 4 feet long and triangular. Its mouth was very long, and it was armed with 2 rows of triangular white teeth as sharp as those as a shark, but in the shape more like that of a sperm whale. Its body was covered with a horny substance, which was much like the carapace of a terrapin, as anything else of which I know. This horny substance was brown in color and of a greenish tinge. The belly of the creature, which I saw after the rope slipped and the carcass was going down, was cream white. Its eyes were round, like those of a fish, and it did not wink. For years now, what could it have been has been the question that is speculated around the area, and even the country, and now the world. It hardly seems likely that so many people could have imagined something so vivid if there had been nothing there. Lake sturgeon, indigenous to both big lakes, can live to be as old as 100 years, grow to 9 feet long and 300 pounds. Their skin is like a shark-like dull gray. Eels are darker but smaller, not getting much longer than 5 feet. Muskellungi can also get over 5 feet long and weigh 70 pounds. Plus, they have rows of sharp teeth. None are apt to convince a boatload of people that they were in the presence of a 25-foot monster, though. It was suggested by cynics that the whole thing was a hoax perpetuated by the passengers and crew, which is also exceedingly unlikely. Dozens of people would have had to have kept that secret for the rest of their lives, while human nature suggests that no group larger than 3 people can be trusted to reliably keep a secret for a long weekend. The Geneva Historical Society can document at least 20 separate reported sightings of the Seneca Lake Monster, most recently in 2013. Cayuga's Old Greenie has a Facebook page. Clearly, the idea that big lakes harbor mysteries beyond our knowledge is one that is held stubborn and collective in our imagination. It's part of the charm of living in small towns, I would say, especially lake towns. I'll Never Go Camping Again by Anonymous. This was sometime in 2015. I had gone camping with a couple of friends. This was probably the 3rd time I'd ever been camping. We were at a pay-to-stay campground. We were even staying in a tiny cabin by a big lake, so it wasn't like we were out in the wild. Now, back then I used to get panic attacks sometimes for no reason. For some reason, despite my immense love for nature, ever since my first camping trip I would often get a panic attack when camping. I couldn't tell you why for the life of me. Well, that night I had one, and it was severe to the point where I had felt like I could not breathe if I stayed in a cabin. But I would get scared if I stayed outside alone. So I had a lot of back and forth, and my poor friends put up with me. At one point I had stepped outside with one of them, my significant other at the time, and was trying to calm down and wondering where I could go pee. My significant other had a flashlight and was leading me to a spot in the dirt at the edge of the trees, between our 2 parked cars. He reasoned it was a good enough distance from the cabin, and yet not in the middle of the woods where some critter could catch me with my pants down. So I agreed, and that's when I saw it. I can still remember. I could barely see the lake from the distance. I stepped past the first car and looked between, and there at the edge of the woods where it meets the lake, I could see something. It looked like a creature. There was minimal light, so I could barely see its silhouette, but I could tell it was not human. It was so strange because it was silent. The creature had the general body shape of what looked like a dog, but its colors and features were more like a hyena, but also like an aquatic monster. It was almost like it was a fusion between the two. I could definitely tell it definitely was capable of living and moving on land, but it also had features that made it look very much like it swam and spent a lot of time in the water. I stood there perfectly still, watching this thing slowly emerge from the water. I only saw its torso and head and the front of its legs. The thing I'll never get over is its face. It looked like it was frozen in time, with its jaw wide open, revealing sharp, bright teeth. Its eyes were looking right at me, but its nose wasn't wrinkled like a snarl, and there was no growling, there was no sound at all. It was the oddest thing. It sent an instant, deep ball of dread down into my core. After I froze for a long moment, I grabbed my significant other's arm and urgently whispered for them to go back in the cabin. I forgot to mention that this thing's eyes were glowing, more than likely reflecting the light. We got in the cabin, and the other 2 friends were asleep, so my significant other didn't see whatever I saw, I'm pretty sure. I'll ask him eventually, but I couldn't sleep that night. With my panic, and now the sight of what I eventually know is to be some sort of water monster, I just could not feel safe. Eventually, I went and slept in my car, because apparently in my brain, that just seemed like the safest place to be. The Horse-Faced Skinwalker by Anonymous. There's a logical explanation for everything. Well, that's what my father always said. Of course, he doesn't know what happened to me and my buddies while camping 9 years ago. Why should he? Adults and most especially parents mistake traumatic events as an overwhelming experience for your age. Or something that your brain can't handle. Or simple imagination. But what happened to me those years ago still scares me to this very day, and it was no imagination. I had just graduated high school, and me and my friends were about to go our separate ways in life. It just felt too soon. They were already talking about careers and colleges, and this scared me because of the thoughts of never seeing them again were very overwhelming. So, when I suggested the thought of a week-long camping trip for one last get-together, they all said yes. We would usually camp in the woods near glacier-filled lakes deep in the wilderness, but for the last get-together I wanted to do something special. We were going to try camping in a section of land known as Sand Wash. Sand Wash is a large extension of land mostly consisting of desert that stretches over the border of Colorado and Wyoming. In the wintertime, Sand Wash was a cold, harsh environment that would chill you to the bone. But the summer was a whole different world. It was, well, just picture desert, I guess, in the summertime, and you got the picture. We graduated early in the summer, so we still had some time before the hot temperatures rolled in. Sand Wash was beautiful. The red-colored rock and the pattern of wild horses give it a vibe like no other place that I have ever camped. We spent a while planning the trip, from how much food we needed to exactly where we would be camping. The stay would be for around a week, if not 5 days, which would mean we were going to have to pack a lot. After packing and deciding the spot where we would set up camp, we set off to Sand Wash. Sand Wash was not too far from where we lived. It was only around a 2-hour drive, and the roads were easy enough to navigate. Once you hear the bussing of dirt bikes and all that good stuff, you know that you're not too far away. Then you start seeing the greenish-blue sagebrush, and you know you're getting very close. It was me and my 3 other friends, and for privacy reasons I'll be calling them Jack, Ryan, and Jacob. All 4 of us inched closer and closer to the gate that separated us from the country in Sand Wash. So I stepped out of the car while everyone else waited, and I undid the metal crate. Then I hopped back into the truck and drove into the desert. The roads were extremely rough, almost like they haven't been used or have been overused. We could hear all the stuff in the trailer bumping around and shuffling around due to the massive rocks and bumps in the road. Everyone was doing that thing 5-year-old kids do when their parents drive over bumpy roads. They make that annoying vocal noise that goes up and down. I thought it was childish at first, but then I eventually found myself joining along. We had reached the turnoff on the dirt road that led us to the site we were camping at. This road took us very far from the main road and even closer to the border of Wyoming. The road didn't look too bad. There were some divots in the road, but nothing worse than the one we had just driven on. So I made the gentle swerve onto that road toward our campsite. After an hour of driving, we could start to see our campsite in the distance. It was situated in the side of a small sand and mud-covered mountain that had a clearing wiped clean of sagebrush and rocks. After driving closer and closer, we noticed a foul stench that grew stronger and stronger. It smelled like a rotting carcass that has been stuck in the sun all day. Jacob, whose eyes were watering at this point, started gagging because of how strong the aroma had become. The stench was so strong that all of us started gagging as well. Now the smell was most likely the rotting body of an antelope or something like that. The desert here doesn't get too much water, so I could comprehend the possibility of a dead, dehydrated antelope. So I just stuck with that and thought that that's what it was. I thought it would go away once we reached the campsite. After 3.5 hours of a bumpy and stench-filled drive, we made it to the site. It was smaller than the pictures looked, but it had enough room for all of us. Without a single word, Ryan opened the trailer and was quickly buried by the misplaced objects that were thrown around while driving. Instead of helping him, we just stood there laughing our asses off because of how stupid he looked. I think he even cracked a smile despite being underneath the grill. Eventually, we all got our cool and started helping him out of the mess and started laying everything out. Our tents were spaced out about 4 feet apart to where we wouldn't be able to hear each other snoring. At around 5:30, we had unpacked and were already getting dinner ready. We were eating smoked barbecue ribs for dinner, which the stench of made our mouths water. We kept all the food that we needed preserved in a suitcase-sized cooler that weighed roughly 70 pounds with ice in them. Soon, there was no sound and light, except the lanterns and Christmas lights we had hung around our campsite, and the old wireless radio we had. We all sat around the campfire telling stories and figuring out what we were going to do with our lives. After eating, which filled us up plenty, I told Jack, who was also the chef and in charge of food, to put the ribs in the cooler and put the ribs away in the trailer. He said alright with a boozy and drunk tone in his voice, even though we didn't bring any alcohol with us, so we all got in our tents and said goodnight to each other. Weapon-wise, all I brought was a .22. I didn't want anything really crazy, but I also wanted something for protection, you know? And a .22, regardless of what anybody says, will take you down if you get a good shot in you. Ryan did see me packing it though, and asked what it was for, and I of course told him. And he replied, "So if we get bored we can shoot some gophers or something?" I said in a playful but decent tone, but I was lying, and he knew it too. When I woke up during the night, I felt like I was drowning. It was like the air was being sucked out of my body, and when I smelt that god-awful rotting corpse smell, but 10 times as strong, I started vomiting and gagging due to the stink it gave off. I could hear everyone else puking inside their tents as well, but what scared me even more was the sound of ice being poured on the ground. "The cooler," somebody said. "It's a goddamn coyote." I clenched my fist with the rage of Jack not putting the cooler away like we asked, and just like that our camping trip is ruined. I slept next to the .22 and stuck it out the small hole in the tent. I had a blind shot, so I stuck the barrel in the air and fired a warning shot. I heard footsteps scurrying away. I knew it left. What really scared me is that the footsteps sounded bipedal. It means whatever it was must have been walking on 2 legs, and it sounded heavy. Each footstep could be felt in my chest. It sent shivers through my spine. I just haven't experienced anything like it before, or since. I jumped out of my tent to see nothing but blackness and firelight illuminating the empty cooler before us. I don't remember what the hell happened. All I remember is sitting there staring into the desert. Ryan and Jacob were both yelling profanities at Jack, and I just sat there speechless, just wondering what the hell had broken into our campsite. A human wouldn't eat raw ribs fresh out of the cooler, and certainly wouldn't walk away towards an active campsite and steal from someone. So, what were we dealing with? The next morning, we checked the damage to see nothing but the spilled ice, now a puddle on the ground. We left that to Jack, but me and Ryan were talking about what happened last night. We came up with some theories, but decided that it was probably gone and not coming back, knowing that we have a weapon. So, I mostly forgot about it, and we just went back to exploring our area and horsing around. We played cards and made sandwiches for lunch, and scouted the area. Eventually we saw the sun sinking below the horizon, so Jack fired up the grill and started getting dinner ready. We sat down and started playing a bunch of songs by Glenn Campbell. Everyone else seemed relaxed but me. I had an uneasy feeling that I was being watched, but I couldn't tell from what it was. But then, we heard the coyotes. Their graceful howl always calmed me down. Their yapping at each other and their howling, for whatever reason, was calming to me. But then, one of the coyotes made a completely different noise. It sounded as if it were being ripped apart, limb by limb, eye by eye. Just the most brutal noise imaginable. It was the noise of suffering and pain. It made us drop our forks and wonder what just happened. We heard one more scream from the coyote and then complete silence. The silence was the worst part. No noise at all. This desert was dead silent. All you could hear was the cackle of our fire. It was as if someone muted everything around us. There was something wrong with the desert and we all knew it. We lost our appetites. The thought that something could rip apart an animal like that just didn't sit right. If it could rip apart a coyote, well, imagine what it could do to us. Suddenly I didn't feel safe at all. Like the .22 in my tent wouldn't be enough. Jacob was on the verge of tears. I have never seen anyone so scared before. We sat there, just listening to any noise, but there was nothing. Just silence. So we decided to sleep it off and wait for daylight. I awoke again with the feeling of drowning. The powerful stench was too much to bear, so I took it out on puking. It was that thing, looking for food once again. I figured that if this thing would return to our campsite, it must be related to the coyotes we had heard being ripped apart earlier. I wanted to see it, but I didn't want to stick my head out of the tent and be stuck with a mental regret for whatever I would see. but I decided it couldn't be too bad. So I unzipped the small window of the tent and froze in horror. It was a man. But as my eyes adjusted and it came closer to the firelight, did I really understand? It was no man. The skin was pale with bare spots of exposed flesh. It looked extremely malnourished and skinny. It had a long streak of dark brown hair running down its spine. Its fingers were each around the size of a pencil and just as thin. But the face is what struck me the hardest. It looked like the face of a man, but stretched out and elongated. Like the face of a horse, but with the details of a man's face. It was pure evil. The way it moved, the way it looked, as if it were uncomfortable in its own body, an amalgamation of everything you would expect to see in hell. Almost like every time it moved, it broke a bone in its body. It was tall. Very tall. At least 10 feet tall. I was no further than 4 feet away from it. My heart was beating faster than it ever has in my entire life. I was crying, sobbing like a baby. After snapping myself out of the shock I was in, I slowly bent down to grab the .22, knowing if I miss it will see me, and there's no telling what could possibly happen next. I was shaking so bad I had to press the gun against my chest to get a steady aim. I slowly unzipped the tent window zipper and fired. I hit it all right. It stood up and ran into the desert, on 2 feet. It scared the living crap out of me. I was not going to step out of that tent. There was no way in hell. What if it came back? What if it ripped open my tent and ran off with me in its grasp? And then came the scream. It was horrible. The sound came from all directions, blowing out my eardrums almost. It sounded like someone was trying to make a woman scream, but out of the tune of a violin. It hurt my ears more than anything I've ever heard. There was no sleeping that night. I was wide awake, fully alert to anything and any sound that came by. But nothing further happened. Nothing at all. I was so scared that even in daylight, I was scared to step out of my tent. Everyone else looked sleep-deprived and scared for their lives. I figured they saw it too, but I didn't want to ask them. So we packed faster than we ever have before. No one said a single word for the entire drive through the sand wash. But when I stopped to pee, I started to smell that foul aroma that covered whatever that thing was. I didn't have any time to pee, and I just decided to hold it. We drove back to the paved road, which felt great because we knew we were out of there for good. On our way back, we stopped at a gas station to grab some food and use the restroom. I walked up to the cashier and she asked me if I was okay. I didn't say anything but wondered why she asked. It was because my hand was still shaking so badly. She must have thought I had Parkinson's or something. Upon making it home to my parents, and they asked me why we came back so early, I told them that there was just some stuff that went down. You know, there was too many bugs and too many people in the site, even though it was rather remote. I don't know. I just didn't want to tell them about our encounter. I don't know what I encountered. A skinwalker maybe, but I'm not going back to find out. I've never told my story before because I thought no one would believe me. But after discovering your show, I wanted to submit my story so other people can hear it without me telling them. Me and those friends meet up every now and then, but that is something we specifically avoid. We refuse to ever talk about it. It's something that still scares us.